Boston, Massachusetts, March 1852. The young man's body hit the cold water of the Charles River before anyone heard him scream. Margaret Whitmore stood at the window above, watching the current take him, her hands perfectly still at her sides. She had paid him $3,000. She had used him, and now he knew too much. She turned from the glass, smoothed the front of her black dress, and walked back to her desk. There were 2 more contracts left to sign. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Boston had always known how to keep its secrets. In the spring of 1852, the city wore its wealth like a fine coat. Polished cobblestones, iron gas lamps flickering gold against the evening fog, and the tall brick mansions of Beacon Hill standing shoulder to shoulder like old men who had agreed, long ago, never to speak of what they knew. It was a city of merchants, bankers, and mill owners. Men who had built enormous fortunes on cotton shipped up from the plantations of Georgia and South Carolina. Men who shook hands at the Athenaeum and attended Sunday services at Trinity Church and smiled at one another over crystal glasses of imported wine, never once speaking of how their money had actually been made. And at the very top of that hill, behind a wrought iron gate and a row of bare winter elms, stood the Whitmore mansion. Most people in Boston knew the name. Margaret Whitmore, widow of the late Charles Whitmore, whose shipping company had made him one of the 10 richest men in the city before his death in 1847. He left behind a fortune, a mansion, and a wife who, according to those who had met her, was not grieving. She was planning. The first time anyone in Boston noticed something strange about the Whitmore household, it was a woman named Agnes Porter who said something. Agnes was a seamstress who did work for several of the Beacon Hill families, and she had gone to the Whitmore estate in the autumn of 1851 to deliver a set of altered gowns. She told her neighbor afterward that she had been made to wait in the front hall for nearly 40 minutes. And in that time, Agnes said, lowering her voice, I heard things I cannot explain. Her neighbor leaned closer. Crying, Agnes said, coming from upstairs. Not one voice, several. Women crying. And then, silence, like someone had told them to stop. Her neighbor told her she was being dramatic. But Agnes Porter was not a dramatic woman. She had worked in Boston's finest homes for 20 years, and she had never, not once, felt what she felt standing in that marble hall. Something was wrong in that house. Something that lived behind the walls, and under the floorboards, and in the space between Margaret Whitmore's careful words. She did not go back. Margaret Whitmore was 58 years old in the spring of 1852. She was not a beautiful woman in the conventional sense, but she carried herself with the kind of authority that made people step aside without knowing why. She wore black, always, not because she was mourning her husband, but because she had decided years ago that black suited her. It made her look serious, permanent, like something that could not be moved. She had 3 daughters. Eleanor was the eldest at 31. Charlotte was 28, and Rebecca, the youngest, had just turned 24. None of them had ever married. In Boston society, this was unusual enough to be noticed. 3 daughters of a wealthy family, none of them attached, none of them appearing at the dinners and concerts and afternoon teas where young women of their class were expected to be seen. People had stopped asking about them years ago. Margaret always gave the same answer. Her daughters were delicate, she would say. They required quiet. They were not suited for the pressures of social life. Most people accepted this, but the servants knew better. Among the women who worked in the Whitmore kitchen and the Whitmore laundry room and the Whitmore garden, there were whispers that had been circulating for years. They were careful whispers, the kind spoken only between women who trusted each other completely, in rooms where no one else could hear. The daughters were not simply delicate, they were confined. There was a woman named Hattie, who had come north from one of the Whitmore family's former plantation properties in South Carolina after the death of Charles Whitmore. She had not come by choice. Margaret had arranged her transport as part of settling the estate, and Hattie had found herself in Boston before she fully understood what was happening. She worked in the kitchen. She was not enslaved. Slavery was illegal in Massachusetts, but she had nowhere to go and no money of her own, and Margaret Whitmore was very good at making arrangements that looked like kindness, but functioned like walls. One evening in the first week of April 1852, Hattie was carrying a tray of tea up the back stairs when she heard voices through a closed door. She should have kept walking. She did not keep walking. Margaret's voice came first, precise and flat as hammered iron. "You will be pleasant, you will be agreeable, and you will not ask him any questions about where he comes from or what his family knows." Then a younger voice, trembling, barely holding itself together. "Mama, I don't want to. I've told you, I don't want this." "What you want," Margaret said, "is not something I have ever found particularly relevant." A pause, then the younger voice again, and this time it broke completely. "What if something happens again? What if it ends the same way?" "Nothing will end the same way," Margaret said. "I have made adjustments. Now stop crying. He arrives Thursday." Hattie stood in the hallway for a long moment, the tea cooling on the tray in her hands. Then she walked back down the stairs, set the tray on the kitchen table, and said nothing to anyone for 3 days. Because Hattie understood something that the other servants were only beginning to piece together. She had seen this before. Not in Boston. Back in South Carolina, on the Whitmore plantation, she had watched the way Charles Whitmore's family managed things they did not want spoken aloud. The way arrangements were made, and then, when the arrangements became inconvenient, unmade, quietly, permanently. She had hoped that coming north meant leaving that world behind. She was beginning to understand that Margaret Whitmore had simply brought that world with her and dressed it in wool and imported lace. The young man arrived on Thursday, just as Margaret had promised. His name was Thomas Caldwell. He was 23 years old, a graduate of Harvard College, the eldest son of a respected Boston family with connections in banking and law. He was handsome in an unremarkable way. Average height, light brown hair, the kind of face that blended comfortably into a crowd. He arrived at the side entrance of the Whitmore mansion at 7:30 in the evening, just as the lamps along the street were being lit. He carried no luggage. He had been told to come quietly. One of the male servants, a man named George who had worked for the Whitmores for 11 years and who kept his expression carefully neutral at all times, let him in without a word and led him up the back stairs to a small sitting room on the 3rd floor. Margaret was waiting. She was seated behind a writing desk, and she did not stand when he entered. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "thank you for coming." Thomas Caldwell looked around the room. It was plainly furnished, a settee, a small fireplace, 2 chairs, and on the desk between them, a folded document. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He cleared his throat. He had practiced what he was going to say on the walk over, but standing in this room, in front of this woman, the words had rearranged themselves into something useless. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She slid the document toward him. "This is the agreement we discussed," she said. $3,000, paid in 2 installments. The first upon your signature tonight, the second upon successful completion of the arrangement. He looked at the paper, but did not pick it up. "And if I have questions?" he said. "You have already asked your questions," she said. "We had 2 meetings prior to this evening. You agreed to the terms." "I agreed in principle," he said.
I hadn't seen the actual document.
Margaret regarded him the way one might regard a child who had asked an inconvenient question in front of company, not with anger, but with a particular brand of patience that was colder than anger. "The document says precisely what I told you it would say," she said. "You will spend 3 weeks in this house. During that time, you will spend evenings with my daughter Charlotte. You will be respectful and discreet. Upon the successful conclusion of the arrangement, you will leave Boston and return when, and only when, I contact you. You will not discuss this with your family. You will not discuss this with your friends. And you will not contact Charlotte directly under any circumstances." She paused. "If a child results," she continued, "that child will be a Whitmore. That is the end of your involvement." Thomas Caldwell sat very still. He was young enough to still believe that the world operated according to rules he understood, that a man could weigh a risk, make a decision, and control what followed. He looked at the document. He thought about $3,000, what it would mean for his debts, for his future, for the small piece of independence it would buy him from his own father's expectations. He picked up the pen. He signed his name. Margaret Whitmore watched him sign, and something crossed her face, so briefly that a person less observant than Thomas might have missed it entirely. It was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was satisfaction. The deep, settled satisfaction of a woman who had done this before and knew exactly how it would unfold. In the kitchen below, Hattie heard the front bell ring and then go quiet. She pressed her hands flat against the wooden table and stared at the grain of the wood. She had seen that look on Margaret Whitmore's face before. The last young man who had worn that expression, the relief of a decision made, a contract signed, a fortune secured, had been found dead in the Charles River 6 months later. His name had been William Ashford, and everyone had called it an accident. 3 weeks passed inside the Whitmore mansion, and Thomas Caldwell told himself every morning that he was in control of the situation. He told himself this the way a man tells himself he is not afraid of the dark, quietly, firmly, and with less conviction each time he said it. Charlotte Whitmore was not what he had expected. He had expected coldness, resignation, a woman who had been handed to a stranger by her mother and had made her peace with it the way people made peace with things they could not change. Instead, Charlotte was sharp and quick and funny in a way that surprised him, and she looked at him sometimes with an expression he could not quite read, something between pity and a warning she wasn't allowed to say out loud. On the 5th evening, they were sitting in the small third-floor room, and Charlotte poured tea without being asked and set his cup in front of him and said very quietly, "You should leave." Thomas looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "I said you should leave." She did not look at him when she said it. She looked at the window. "Take the money you've already been paid. Walk out the side door tonight. Don't come back." He laughed. Not because it was funny, but because he didn't know what else to do. "Mrs. Whitmore would—" "My mother," Charlotte said, cutting him off with a precision that stopped him cold, "is not someone you understand yet." She finally turned and looked at him directly, and there was something in her eyes that was not dramatic or theatrical. It was real. It was tired and real and frightened in the way only a person who has watched something happen more than once can be frightened. "The man before you was named William Ashford. He was 25. He was kind. He signed the same papers you signed, in the same chair where you're sitting now." Thomas said nothing. "They found him in the river in November," Charlotte said. "My mother attended the memorial service. She wore her best mourning dress." The fire crackled between them. Thomas set down his cup very carefully. "Charlotte," he said slowly, "what exactly are you telling me?" But before she could answer, the door opened. Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway. She looked at Charlotte first, then at Thomas,
and her expression did not change by a single degree. She had the face of a woman who had walked into rooms at exactly the wrong moment many times before, and had learned to make that fact work in her favor. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. Charlotte looked away. "Not at all," Thomas said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. Margaret smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't involve her eyes. "Mr. Caldwell, it's getting late. George will show you to your room." She paused. "Charlotte, come with me." Charlotte stood up without a word. She walked past Thomas and did not look at him again, and he watched the door close behind them both, and he sat in that room alone for a long time, staring at the fire, thinking about a man named William Ashford floating face down in the Charles River. He thought about leaving. He thought about it very seriously, with the full attention of a man who understands he is in danger. And then he thought about $3,000 and the debts his father did not know about, and the very specific way his life would fall apart without that money, and he stayed. That decision would cost him everything. Downstairs, in the kitchen, Hattie was the only one still awake. She heard Margaret's footsteps on the stairs. She heard Charlotte's voice, muffled and strained, from somewhere down the hall. And then she heard Margaret say something that made Hattie press her back against the kitchen wall and hold absolutely still. "Stop being sentimental," Margaret said. "It never ends well for the people who are sentimental." A door closed. Silence. Hattie stood in that silence for a long time. Then she crossed the kitchen, sat down at the table, and began to do something she had not done in years. She began to pray. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, in the way women pray when they know they are living inside something that has already been decided, and they are asking, very humbly, for one small mercy inside it. 6 weeks later, in the middle of May, Thomas Caldwell left the Whitmore mansion. He left with the second half of his payment tucked inside his coat, and a story he had already prepared for his family. A business opportunity in Providence, a friend who needed his help. Nothing worth explaining in detail. He walked down the side steps of the mansion just after dawn and did not look back. He was dead before August. His horse threw him on a road outside Concord on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. The animal panicked without apparent cause, and Thomas was thrown at a bend in the road and struck his head against a stone marker. And by the time another rider found him, the ground beneath him was dark, and he was already gone. The coroner called it a riding accident, and it was possibly exactly that. Except that 3 men who had known Thomas Caldwell told nearly identical stories afterward, each without knowing the others had said it. Each of them remembered that in the final weeks of Thomas's life, he had seemed afraid. Not the ordinary, manageable fear of a man with debts or troubles, but something else. Something that lived just behind his eyes and made him choose his words with unusual care. One of them, a man named Robert Stiles, who had been Thomas's closest friend at Harvard, went further than the others. "He told me he had made a mistake," Robert said. "He wouldn't tell me what it was, but he said if anything happened to him, I should remember the name Whitmore." Robert paused, then added quietly, "I remembered it. I just didn't know what to do with it." None of them did anything, because there was nothing to do. The Whitmores were not people you made accusations against without evidence. They were not people you visited in an official capacity without invitation. They were not people the city of Boston was prepared to investigate, because investigating them meant looking at the foundations of things. And the foundations of things in Boston in 1852 were not meant to be looked at. Dr. Jonathan Hale heard the name Whitmore for the first time in September of that year. He heard it from a woman named Clara, who did laundry for 3 of the Beacon Hill families and who came to his small practice on a Tuesday morning, not because she was sick, but because she had a piece of information she needed to hand to someone responsible, and she didn't know anyone responsible except the doctor who had treated her daughter's fever the previous winter. She sat in the chair across from his desk and folded her hands in her lap and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you won't say where you heard it." Hale promised. Clara told him about William Ashford. She told him about the contract and the money and the 3 weeks in the mansion. She told him what she knew about Thomas Caldwell. And then she told him about a third name, a young man named Peter Morse, who had signed a contract in the spring of 1850 and had died of a sudden illness in December of that same year, and whose mother had asked questions afterward that no one had answered. Hale listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How many men are we talking about altogether?" Clara looked at her hands. "That I know of? 4. But Hattie, the woman who works in their kitchen, she says there were others before I started paying attention." Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the pregnancies?" Clara's expression shifted into something complicated. "That's the part that I keep trying to understand, Doctor. Because the women in that house, the daughters, they do fall pregnant. The servants can see it. Hattie has seen it with her own eyes more than once." She paused. "But no child has ever left that house." Hale leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Clara said carefully, "that babies go in, but they don't come out. No baptisms, no announcements, no funerals even. They just disappear. Same as the men." The room was very quiet. Hale looked at the window. Outside, Boston was going about its morning. Horses, cartwheels, the distant sound of a church bell marking the hour. An ordinary city doing ordinary things, completely unaware of what this woman had just placed on his desk. "I'll need to speak with Hattie directly," he said. "She won't speak to you," Clara said immediately. "Not directly. She's too afraid." "Afraid of what, exactly?" Clara looked at him steadily. "Dr. Hale, that woman was brought north from a Whitmore plantation in South Carolina. She has no papers, no family here, no money." If Margaret Whitmore decided tomorrow that Hattie had said the wrong thing to the wrong person, there is not a single soul in this city who would come to her defense. She paused. "You understand what I'm saying?" He understood. He understood it completely, and the understanding settled in his chest like cold water, because it meant that the walls around the Whitmore secret were not just the walls of wealth and reputation. They were the walls of race, of legal invisibility, of a system that had been designed very carefully over a very long time to make certain kinds of people impossible to hear. Margaret Whitmore had not brought that system north by accident. She had brought it north because she needed it. And she had been using it right here on Beacon Hill, in the shadow of churches and universities and the offices of men who wrote speeches about liberty, for longer than anyone had been willing to notice. Hale sat at his desk for a long time after Clara left. Then he opened a drawer and took out a clean sheet of paper and began to write down names. William Ashford, Thomas Caldwell, Peter Morse. He did not know yet how many more there would be before this was finished. He did not know yet what he was truly walking toward. But he wrote the names down anyway, because somebody had to. And in this city, in this year, it appeared that the somebody was going to be him. The list on Hale's desk grew slowly through the autumn of 1852, the way dangerous things often grow, quietly and without announcing themselves until they are already too large to ignore. By October, he had 6 names, 6 young men, 6 contracts, 6 deaths that the city had absorbed without question, the way a wealthy city absorbs inconvenient truths, by filing them under the wrong heading and moving on. He had not yet spoken directly to anyone inside the Whitmore household. Clara had been right about that. Hattie would not come to him. And he could not go to her without alerting Margaret, and alerting Margaret before he had something solid enough to act on would accomplish nothing except making him the seventh name on a list nobody was supposed to be keeping. So he waited. And he watched. And one gray morning, in the first week of November, the waiting ended without warning, the way things in Boston often did, with a knock at the door at an hour when no one should have been knocking. The woman standing on his step was young, perhaps 20, and she was wearing a servant's dress under a coat that was not warm enough for the weather. She was shaking, but not from the cold. Hale could tell the difference. He opened the door wider. "Come in." She came in. She stood just inside the doorway and did not sit down, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say so many times that now, standing in front of the actual person, the words have gone somewhere they cannot be reached. "My name is May," she said finally. "I work in the Whitmore house. Hattie sent me." Hale kept his voice even. "Sit down, May." "I can't stay long," she said. "They'll notice." "Then tell me quickly." May pressed her hands together in front of her. "There's a man," she said. "A new one. He's been in the house since last week. Young. His name is Daniel Foster." She paused. "Hattie says he's the one for Miss Rebecca this time, the youngest daughter." Hale felt something tighten in his chest. "Does he know? About the others?" "No," May said. "He knows nothing. He's—" She stopped herself, started again. "He's kind, Doctor. He talks to us like we're people. He helped George carry a trunk up the stairs and didn't act like it was beneath him." Her voice cracked very slightly on that last word. "Hattie doesn't want him to end up in the river." Hale stood up. "I need to speak with him directly." "You can't go to the house." "Then how?" May reached into her coat and produced a small folded piece of paper. "He walks to the post office every Tuesday morning, alone. Hattie arranged it. Mrs. Whitmore thinks he's sending a letter to his family in Connecticut." She held the paper out. "That's the route he takes." Hale took the paper. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at May. "You took a significant risk coming here." She met his eyes. "Hattie took a bigger one. She was up half the night deciding whether to send me." May pulled her coat tighter and moved toward the door. "She said to tell you something else. She said the ones who died, it wasn't all accidents." "Some of them maybe, but not all." She put her hand on the door handle. "She said Mrs. Whitmore has a man, someone she uses. She doesn't know his name, but she's seen him at the house twice, always just before something happens to one of the young men." The door closed behind her. Hale stood in the silence of his office and looked at the piece of paper in his hand. A fixer. Margaret Whitmore had someone who cleaned up after her, which meant the deaths were not simply managed, they were arranged. Which meant this was not the story of a desperate woman making terrible choices in isolation. This was an operation. Careful, practiced, and protected by money and the indifference of a city that had decided long ago not to look too hard at the foundations of its own comfort. He met Daniel Foster on a Tuesday morning, 3 days later. Foster was 22. He had an open, honest face and the slightly dazed expression of a man who had agreed to something he was still processing. He stopped walking when Hale fell into step beside him and introduced himself, and his first instinct was to be polite, which told Hale something important about him. "I know who you are," Foster said carefully. "How do you know who I am?" "I know about the contract you signed," Hale said. "I know about the money." "And I know about William Ashford, Thomas Caldwell, and at least 4 other men who signed the same contract and are no longer alive." Foster stopped walking entirely. He stood on the pavement and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "You're trying to frighten me." "I'm trying to keep you alive," Hale said. "There's a difference, and right now, it matters." Foster looked at him. The politeness was still there, but something behind it had shifted.
The dazed quality was gone. In its place was something sharper, more careful, like a man rapidly reassessing everything he thought he understood about his current situation. "Charlotte warned me," he said. Not to Hale specifically, more to himself, half under his breath. Then, louder, "She told me the first night. She said her mother had done this before, and it didn't end well." "Did she tell you how it ended?" Foster's jaw tightened. "She said a man died. I thought she was exaggerating, or testing me." He paused. "I thought it was a strange family with unusual methods and a woman who was overly controlling, but I didn't think—" He stopped, started again. $3,000 is a great deal of money, Doctor." "It is," Hale agreed. "It's also what every man on this list was paid, right up until the moment he wasn't around to spend it." They stood there together on a Boston street in November. Two men in the middle of something that was much larger and much older than either of them. And Hale watched the reality of it move across Daniel Foster's face like weather. Then Foster said something that Hale had not expected. "Rebecca knows too," he said. Hale looked at him sharply. "Not everything," Foster said, "but she knows something is wrong. She talks to me differently than Charlotte does." She's trying to protect me. But Rebecca, she's trying to tell me something, and she can't say it directly because she's afraid. And she keeps starting sentences she doesn't finish." He ran a hand through his hair. "Last night she asked me if I had family who would notice if I disappeared. Just like that. Calm as anything. If I had family who would notice." The weight of that sentence sat between them. "What did you tell her?" Hale asked. "I told her yes," Foster said. "I have a mother and two brothers in Hartford, and they would notice within a week." He looked at Hale. She seemed relieved, like that actually meant something to her. He paused. "What does that mean, Doctor?" "It means she's trying to protect you with the only tool she has," Hale thought. "It means she has watched men die, and she has been powerless to stop it. And she is hoping that a man with people who will ask questions is a man too dangerous to kill quietly." He did not say all of this to Foster. He said, "It means you should leave the house today, not tonight, today." Foster was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the money?" Hale looked at him steadily. "You've been paid the first half?" "Yes." "Then you have $1,500. And you have your life. That is an excellent transaction, Mr. Foster. I would encourage you to consider it complete." Something crossed Foster's face, the specific expression of a young man choosing between pride and survival, which is one of the oldest choices in the world, and one that young men consistently get wrong. He got it right. "All right," he said. "I'll leave today. Don't say goodbye. Don't send a note. Don't explain yourself. Just go." Foster nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "What about the daughters? What about Rebecca and Charlotte? They're still in there." It was the right question to ask, and Hale did not have a right answer to give him, and that fact sat in his stomach like a stone. "I'm working on it," he said. Foster looked at him for a moment, and in that look Hale saw something that would stay with him for a long time afterward. The expression of a man who understood, fully and clearly, that he was being asked to save himself and leave women behind who could not save themselves, and who was doing it anyway, not because he didn't care, but because there was simply nothing else to be done. Foster walked away. Hale stood on the pavement and watched him go. And then, because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but keep moving forward, he turned in the other direction and walked toward the one place he had been avoiding for months.
He had been making quiet inquiries for weeks about Margaret Whitmore's household accounts, her legal arrangements, her connections. And what he had learned, piece by careful piece, was that the Whitmore family's wealth was not simply inherited money sitting quietly in a Boston bank. It was active, moving, connected to transactions that ran south, to names in South Carolina and Georgia, to plantation ledgers and property arrangements that had survived the death of Charles Whitmore by being restructured very cleverly in Margaret's name. Which meant that the system Hattie lived inside was not just Margaret's personal cruelty. It was the same system that had enslaved Hattie's mother and grandmother and every woman in her line before her, wearing a different set of clothes in a northern city, operating through different mechanisms, but built on the same foundational belief that certain people did not have the standing to be heard. And Margaret Whitmore had understood, with the cold intelligence that defined everything she did, that as long as that remained true, she was untouchable. Hale understood it now too. The question was what he was going to do about it. Because Daniel Foster was safe, but Rebecca was not. Charlotte was not. And Hattie, who had started all of this by sending a young woman through the cold to knock on his door at dawn, was not. And somewhere in that house was a man whose name no one knew, who moved quietly through Boston doing Margaret Whitmore's errands, and who would be given a new name very soon, if Hale did not find him first. He had been a doctor for 19 years. He had made his career treating people the city preferred not to see. He had learned, slowly and at great cost, that the work of bearing witness was sometimes the most dangerous work of all. He was about to learn exactly how dangerous. Daniel Foster left the Whitmore mansion on a Tuesday afternoon and was on a coach to Hartford by nightfall. He did not say goodbye. He did not send a note. He walked out the side door with his coat and his $1,500, and he did not look back, exactly as Hale had told him to do. Margaret Whitmore discovered he was gone by Wednesday morning. Hattie was in the kitchen when it happened. She heard Margaret's footsteps on the stairs, not the usual measured pace, but something faster, harder, with a quality that made every person in that house go very still, the way animals go still when they feel the pressure drop before a storm. Margaret came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at Hattie directly, which she almost never did. "Did you know he was leaving?" she said. Hattie kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring. "No, ma'am." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "If I find out differently," Margaret said, "you will not enjoy what comes next." She left. Hattie kept stirring. Her hand was perfectly steady. Everything else inside her was not. She had been living inside Margaret Whitmore's particular brand of threat for 5 years, and she had learned something important about it. Margaret did not make idle statements. When she said you would not enjoy what came next, she had already decided what came next. The only variable was timing. Hattie had until Margaret figured out who had warned Daniel Foster. She did not think that would take long. 2 miles away, Hale was sitting at his desk reading a letter that had arrived that morning from a journalist named Silas Webb, who worked for a small reform-minded paper called the Massachusetts Freeman. Webb had been investigating labor conditions in the textile mills, and in the course of that work had come across a name, a man named Aldous Crane, who did private work for several of Boston's wealthiest families. The kind of private work that was never written down. Webb had heard Crane's name connected to 2 deaths in the past 3 years. Neither had been investigated seriously. Both had been ruled accidental. One of them was William Ashford. Hale read the letter twice. Then he put on his coat and went to find Silas Webb. Webb turned out to be a small, precise man in his late 30s who wore ink-stained cuffs and had the particular energy of someone who had been living on insufficient sleep and excessive purpose for so long that he had forgotten what the alternative felt like. He met Hale in the back room of his paper's office and listened without interrupting
while Hale laid out everything he knew, the contracts, the names, the pattern of deaths, the daughters, Hattie, the infants that never appeared. When Hale finished, Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been sitting on this alone?" "Since September." Webb looked at him with something that was not quite admiration and not quite exasperation, but lived somewhere between the two. "Dr. Hale, if half of what you're describing is accurate, this woman has been operating in plain sight for at least 4 years, possibly longer." "I know. And no one has said a word." "The people who know are people this city has decided not to listen to," Hale said. "A kitchen worker brought north from a plantation, a laundress, a seamstress, not a single name that a Boston court would treat as credible without documentation." Webb leaned forward. "Then we get documentation. That's why I'm here." They worked through the afternoon. Webb had sources Hale didn't. People inside the city's legal machinery, a clerk at the county records office who owed him a significant favor, a retired constable who had noted the Ashford drowning as suspicious in his private journal and had been waiting for a reason to say so publicly. By early evening, they had something. Not enough to arrest anyone, not enough to put in front of a judge, but enough to make noise. And in Boston in 1852, strategic noise was sometimes the only tool available to people who couldn't afford silence. Then the knock came. It was May again, and this time she was not shaking from the cold or from nerves. She was shaking from something that looked closer to terror, and when Hale opened the door, she pushed past him into the room without being asked, and turned to face both men with her hands pressed flat against her sides. "Hattie's gone," she said. The room went very quiet. "What do you mean, gone?" Hale said. "I mean she wasn't in the kitchen this morning, and she wasn't in her room, and her things are still there, but she isn't." May's voice was controlled, but just barely. "Mrs. Whitmore told the other servants that Hattie had decided to return south, that she'd arranged it herself, that she'd left before dawn." "And you don't believe that?" Webb said. May looked at him with an expression that said the question barely deserved an answer. "Hattie had nowhere south to go back to. Everything she had was in that kitchen. She wouldn't leave her Bible. She wouldn't leave the photograph of her sister." She stopped. "She wouldn't leave without telling me." Hale felt something move through him that was cold and certain and very old. It was the feeling of a man who has been moving carefully in dangerous territory and has just realized he moved one step too slowly. "When did you last see her?" he asked. "Yesterday evening, just after Mrs. Whitmore came downstairs." May met his eyes. "I think she knows, Doctor. I think she knows it was Hattie who sent me to you." The name Aldous Crane was in Hale's mind before May finished speaking. He looked at Webb. Webb was already reaching for his coat. They found Aldous Crane before Crane found them, which Hale would later consider the single piece of luck in an otherwise relentlessly unlucky chain of events. Webb's retired constable knew Crane by face and knew his habits, and by 10 o'clock that night they had located him in a boarding house near the waterfront, and had 2 witnesses present when they confronted him in the front room. Crane was a broad, unremarkable man in his 50s who looked at Hale and Webb the way a man looks at an inconvenience he fully expects to resolve. He said nothing when they sat down across from him. He looked at the door. He looked at the 2 witnesses. He recalculated. Webb put a piece of paper on the table between them. "William Ashford," he said. "Thomas Caldwell, Peter Morse. 3 names I can connect to you through recorded transactions and witness accounts. A 4th connection pending." He paused. "I'm giving you one opportunity to tell me where Hattie is." Crane looked at the paper. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt, exactly. More like a man adjusting to new information about how much the other side actually knew. "I don't know anyone named Hattie," he said. "You were at the Whitmore house on the 14th of this month," Hale said. 2 days before Daniel Foster disappeared. 2 days before Hattie disappeared. He leaned forward.
That is a very specific coincidence, Mr. Crane.
Crane said nothing.
Here is what I know about your situation, Webb said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way that quiet becomes more frightening than volume. I have a story that is going to press in 4 days. Right now, that story contains your name in connection with 2 accidental deaths. If Hattie is found alive before then, your name appears once in a footnote as a person of interest.
If she is not found alive, he let the sentence complete itself in the air between them. The silence lasted a long time. Then Crane said, "There's a property outside Charlestown. The family owns it through a secondary arrangement." He looked at the table. "She's there. She's not harmed." Hale stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor.
They found Hattie in a locked room in a cold outbuilding on a property registered to a holding company that traced back, through 3 layers of paperwork, to the estate of the late Charles Whitmore. She had been there for just over 30 hours. She was cold and frightened, and she had been given nothing to eat. But she was alive, and she was unharmed. And when Hale opened the door and she saw his face, she sat down on the floor very suddenly, as though her legs had simply decided that the emergency was over and they were done. He crouched down next to her. "Can you walk?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. The woman had been locked in a room by herself for a day and a half in November, and her voice was steady, and Hale found himself thinking that he had never in his life met anyone with more composure under impossible circumstances. "Then let's go," he said. Webb's story ran 5 days later, not 4. He had spent the extra day verifying every name and every date because he understood that a story this explosive, aimed at a family this powerful, could not contain a single error. The Massachusetts Freeman was a small paper, but the story was picked up within 2 weeks by 3 larger publications, and within a month it had reached New York. Margaret Whitmore's response was immediate and precise. Her lawyers sent letters. Witnesses found reasons to revise their accounts. 2 of the servants who had spoken to Webb quietly left the city. The records Webb had used were challenged on technical grounds, and the county clerk who had provided them was removed from his position within 60 days. Charlotte Whitmore disappeared from the house in January of 1853 and was never publicly accounted for. Rebecca followed in March. Whether they left by choice or by their mother's arrangement, no one could say with certainty. Margaret herself never faced a legal proceeding. She continued to live in the Beacon Hill mansion, attended by reduced staff, moving through the city with the untouchable calm of a woman who had simply waited out a difficult season. She died in October 1854, peacefully, in her own bed. The obituary in the Boston Daily Advertiser described her as a devoted widow and a woman of considerable civic virtue. Hale kept his list. He added names to it even after the story faded from the papers, even after the momentum collapsed, even after the city decided it had spent enough energy on something it would rather not have known. He kept it because he believed, in the stubborn and unfashionable way of a man who has given his life to bearing witness, that a recorded truth is never entirely dead. And he wrote one more thing, at the bottom of his final notes, in the careful handwriting of a man who chooses his words with the knowledge that someone will eventually read them. He wrote, "The crime was not hidden. It was performed in a city that had decided, long ago, to practice a particular kind of blindness when the perpetrator was wealthy enough, and the victims were the kind of people the law had been designed not to see. What I uncovered was not a secret. It was a choice. Boston's choice. And the question that will outlast every name on this list is not what Margaret Whitmore did. It is what a city tells itself when it decides that some people's lives are worth less than the comfort
of not looking. Hattie left Boston in the spring of 1853. Hale helped her obtain the papers she needed. She went to Philadelphia, where a community of free black residents and abolitionists had built something that functioned, imperfectly but genuinely, as a new beginning. She never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed in the Whitmore house. She had said what she needed to say to the people she had chosen to say it to, and she had paid a price for that, and she was done. But before she left, she came to Hale's office one last time. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and she looked at him with the same steady, unreadable expression she had worn through everything, and she said, "Did it matter? All of it. Did it change anything?" Hale thought about William Ashford in the river. He thought about Thomas Caldwell on a road outside Concord. He thought about 6 names on a list and a city that had filed them all under the wrong heading. He thought about Daniel Foster on a coach to Hartford, alive. He thought about Hattie herself, sitting in front of him, breathing, preparing to walk out of one life and into another. "It mattered to the people it saved," he said. "I don't know if that's enough, but I think it has to be." Hattie looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and stood up and put on her coat and walked out the door and into the cold Boston morning, and did not look back. Some stories end with justice, some end with truth, and some end with a woman walking away from a city that tried to disappear her, still upright, still whole, carrying everything that could not be taken from her into whatever came next. This one ends there. Sonnet 4.6, Extended.